But he advised us to record it.
Good evening. This is the regularly scheduled March meeting. Is it March? No, it's June meeting. June meeting of the Historical Society of Frankfurt. It's the last of the season before we take a summer break. So we'll miss you over the summer, but we'll be back in September. Tonight we have, and I just learned this, it's not just simple archaeologist, it's anthropological archaeology that Rebecca Yamin practices, along with urban archaeology and what was the other? Historical archaeology. We're pleased to have her. Her first degree was from the University of Pennsylvania in anthropology in 1964. And she took some years off to do family things and then got her master's and then PhD at New York University in 1978. 88. Wrote it down wrong. Or too small to read. So we're very pleased to have her. Before we start, I have one announcement tonight. We're happy to announce that the long-awaited book about the Frankfurt Yellow Jackets by Brian Michael and Andrew Weicker will be available in July. Check our website next month for more information, please. Rebecca has two books in print currently, one of which we have a few copies of here tonight, Archaeology at the State Museum of the American Revolution. And the other would have to be ordered from the publisher. That information perhaps she'll give it to you at the end of her talk. Digging in the City of Brotherly Love, which sounds very relevant to us. So with that, I give you Rebecca Yamin.
Do I have to sit here because of the mic?
You have to sit where you're going to be received by the mic.
That's what I mean. So I can't walk around here.
Oh, no, you won't be heard if you walk. We only have the one mic.
Okay. Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. And I can't believe that you have so many wonderful artifacts, but I especially can't believe that there's so many recent publications that are pertinent to the specific history of this community. And you know, I write books and it's hard to write books. And these books are thick and researched and very impressive. So it's really a joy to see and a revelation to know that all this good work is being done right here. I have to be down here to be heard in the mic. Okay, I just want to be sure that I'm not leaving stuff out. As you probably know, I have dug a lot of stuff up in Philadelphia and in other places besides. As you probably also know, the stuff is only the beginning. It all means something, not just as things, but as people's things, things they cared about, chose to have because they needed them for work or for keeping house or for communicating who they were. Things are not just things, they are the furniture of our lives. Today I'm going to talk about things that belong to a few artisans I have encountered on archaeological projects in Philadelphia, a coachmaker and a cabinet maker on the Liberty Bell site on Independence Mall, a cutler on the site of the Museum of the American Revolution, and a plasterer who was imprisoned at Eastern State Penitentiary. They were all skilled men who left evidence of their lives in the ground. What is amazing is that that evidence has survived in spite of the ground disturbances that are characteristic of urban places. Even I, who have been doing urban archaeology for the last, 20, 30 years, am astonished every time I approach a site in the city. Because you think, how could there be anything left here? You know, there's so many streets and so much fill and so much activity, and yet we dig down, and by God, you know, there are remnants from the 18th century, the 17th century. I've never dug a 16th century site, sadly, but it's just even astonishes me time after time. And in fact, I worry, because when I tell a client this is going to cost you $1.5 million because we're going to find so much, and then I think, you know, what if we find nothing? And the client is going to think how foolish, she was sure it was going to cost so much. Anyway, on the Liberty Bell Center site, for instance, 19th century buildings. This is one of my favorite pictures. Oops, why isn't it on the screen? Is it on the screen? No. Okay. There it is. There it is. Okay. I don't know if you've all seen this picture. It's such an incredible picture. We're standing behind Independence Hall and looking down the mall, which of course wasn't the mall. It was the 3 blocks were filled with these buildings until the National Park Service took them down in the 1950s. It just blows my mind to look at that picture. Eventually, of course, they took them down, and what's left is the mess from the rubble of deconstructing the buildings. And what we do in urban archaeology is we have to get, and what's left in the ground are the deep basements for the buildings that were standing there. So the 19th century buildings that had deep basements, they leave the basements in the ground. When they deconstruct the building, they take the rubble and fill the basements up. So in urban archaeology, what we have to do is get the big machines to take the rubble out of the basements, lift up the basement floors, and see what's underneath, if there's anything underneath. Because the 19th century basements will have cut off the old ground surfaces. So most of what we find is not a ground surface, it's the bottoms of the things that penetrated the ground surface. So it's usually shafts that were either wells or cisterns, or in many cases, privies, which of course are the holes under the outhouses, which are filled with human waste. And human waste, happily, is sticky and thick and cradles the artifacts. So many of the artifacts that we find and we tell stories from have actually been cradled by human waste. And yes, it does smell, but it doesn't happily smell the same. It has its own distinct, old kind of odor, which we have to endure. But I mean, it's worth it. And fascinating that this should be the source of so much good data. And people who read my books always say, I had no idea that it was all about privies. And yes, urban archaeology is all about privies, no question about it. So when we get to I tend to, digress from my text, and then I get mixed up and I don't tell you everything I want to tell you. Anyway, on the Liberty Bell Center site, which I worked for John Milner Associates, and we happily got to excavate that site before they built the building. So we're talking about the first block right across from Independence Hall. So once, that's it, yeah. So once the basements have been cleaned out, we've lifted up the floors, and we reveal the structures, the bottoms of structures that are still left in the ground. So one of those privies, and here it is, belonged to Thomas Ogle, who was a coachman. I just must tell you that I've been very fortunate in my career to get to dig in these significant places. I mean, I never forgot that I'm right there at Independence Hall. Little old me is digging right in front of Independence Hall. So it seemed very significant to be allowed to look under that ground and to find, what had happened all the way back to the beginning of this country. So on Thomas Ogle's privy, he was a carriage maker, and this is a picture from I'm sure it's a book you know about colonial craftsmanship, and that's a typical carriage maker's shop. And he had two lots, two-lot parcel on which there was a room for manufacturing activities, open spaces for heating and setting tires, and a protected area in which freshly varnished carriages could be washed and sun-dried to harden the finish. Ogle had taken over David Clark's coachmaking business in 1794. George Washington was one of Clark's clients, so Ogle was inheriting a distinguished clientele. Except for receipts for work done for Thomas Butler Esquire, who lived nearby on Chestnut Street, there's no written record of Ogle's business. In 1815 and 1816, the receipts mention mending a front spring, cutting the tires of wheels, and cleaning and oiling a carriage, as well as commission for a sale of coaches. In 1825, Butler paid $300 for a second-hand coach with patent accessories and $5 for chair strap plates. In 1827, he paid $395 for a price difference in an exchange of carriages. So the artifacts recovered, Okay, from Ogle's privy reflect his large household. From census records, we know that in 1820, besides his wife, Ogle's household included 3 boys and 2 girls under 16, most likely his children, 7 males, probably apprentices under 20. Apprentices generally received board, clothing, a freedom suit, medical care, and some formal schooling in return for their labor. Dinner was apparently served on these blue edge decorated dishes. It's whiteware. I don't know if you care about what kind of ware it was, but as you can see, they're matched. They're pretty nice. Had a whole set, and it would have been a nicely set table for all of that big household. The apprentices also would have been at the table. These are redware and yellowware and, the dishes that came out of the kitchen. This is teaware, not very elegant, not matched. These are unmatched things that would have been used together. These are also unmatched, but a little more elegant. We're talking the 1820s, 1810s. I can't remember the exact date of this privy, the closing date, but this is the period, the early decade of the 19th century. Glasses, and these are the only tools that were found, but at least they confirmed that we were, when we interpreted that we were looking at the household of a coachman, the tools confirmed that there was something left from the work that had been going on. So the tool on the left is related to sewing, and they're made of bone. That's the case for the sewing implement. And the next tool is called a netting mesh, which was a flat tool made of bone that was used to make loops for nets, probably the pouches that hung on coach doors. I remember when I was a kid, we used to take the sleeping train to Pittsburgh, and when I slept in the top bunk, there were those net mesh bags that hung. So I think that must be what the netting tool was used for. I assume that's similar to those bags that hung on the coach doors. And a brass thimble. That's what the brass thimble looked like. Alexander Turnbull's cabinet shop. This is the other artisan who lived on the Liberty Bell Center site. This is an image of what his shop would have looked like. Next door to Ogle's coach manufacturing, Turnbull opened his shop in 1801 and was there until his death in 1826. He also would have needed 2-lot space for manufacturing activities as well as storing wood. He apparently also had room for sales. An insurance policy dating to 1813 mentions a cabinet wareroom, and directories for 1818 to 19 describe furniture stock for sale. Turnbull's household was considerably smaller than Ogle's, and there were fewer apprentices. In 1810, the household included 3 boys under 16, 2 girls under 10, 2 boys under 20, probably apprentices, and also a girl under 20, possibly an upholsterer. Now you will notice that the data about people that we are working with is very minimal. You know, it just comes from the census, and if you get an occasional receipt, that's great. But to say something about these people beyond that data is difficult. What we have are the material possessions of these households. And from those material possessions, we try to interpret what those people's lives were like, because that's what I'm interested in. I'm an anthropological archaeologist because I'm interested in people's lives. I'm not just interested in stuff. I'm interested in how that stuff tells us about the kinds of people who aren't in historical documents. These are just everyday people, but they're the people, of course, who make up this population that is society. So that is our purpose, as our purpose is to be able to recognize these people who are otherwise not recognized in anything except lists in a census record, which really isn't telling you terribly much. Although Turnbull's and Ogle's tax assessments were identical, the artifacts recovered from Turnbull's privy were considerably fancier. Like the Ogles, they had a set of everyday blue decorated tableware, but they also had 2 very elegant sets of Chinese export porcelain, one decorated in the Fitzhugh pattern. That's what this is. It happens to be my favorite pattern. I wish I could have dishes like that. There were matching serving dishes and etched glassware, this gorgeous bottles. A great variety of food remains suggested that the Turnbull's meals included several courses: soup first, a fish or wild bird course, a second, and a main course of roast beef, steak, veal, or mutton. Many tea sets were identified, 3 in Chinese porcelain, fancy. There were child-sized dishes, including cups with didactic messages. This is supposedly teaching you how to be a capitalist when you grow up. Because you own a cup that has your name on it, or it tells you how to behave, like I'm a good girl, and for my, what is that? So, I don't know what that says. Well, here's one with Carolina's name on it. And there was also a multi-piece set of doll china. So raising children is a big issue. And of course, the artifacts are what tells us about how people are treating their children, what they think it's important for children to have. So in this case, you can see marbles and dominoes and, you know, the slate board and the dishes. I don't think I saw any children's dishes downstairs. I did go down to the museum, and I think maybe I didn't see any children's dishes, but they're common. So the differences in the Ogle and Turnbull artifact assemblages suggest the tension that was being felt by artisans in this time period, the first decades of the 19th century. According to historians, the position of artisan businessmen was unsettled. Artisans like cabinet makers and coach makers, like Turnbull and Ogle, tended to still be categorized as manual laborers, even though as masters of their own shops, many no longer worked with their hands. They made a good deal more money than journeymen and apprentices who did the manual work. But the historian Gordon Wood, one of my favorites, has pointed out money did not automatically translate into self-esteem and self-worth in the face of age-old scorn in which their occupations were held. There were two routes to increasing self-esteem. One was to indulge in conspicuous consumption, which was associated with the then emerging middle-class status. So we would certainly think that Turnbull was a candidate for that with his fancy dishes and his children's things and all that stuff. If you could set an elegant table, serve multi-course expensive meals, which was typical of Turnbull, display concern for properly educating your children, also Turnbull, and hold fancy tea parties, you separated yourself out from the cruder ways of manual laborers. A second route to respectability was to associate with organizations of mechanics who were committed to a tradition of usefulness or decent competency, as it was called. These people chose science rather than conspicuous consumption to identify their new status. Philadelphia's major science museum, the Franklin Institute, was founded in this period in 1824 and was first located in City Hall at the corner of Chestnut and Fifth Street, virtually a stone's throw from Turnbull and Ogle's shops. So when I found these two assemblages associated with two artisans, a coachman and a carpenter, I couldn't understand why they were so different. So by reading history and learning from Gordon Wood, I found that there was this tension and there was this challenge of how you were going to achieve respectability when you were still being treated as an inferior in society. So it was pretty neat. When I was doing this project, which was pretty long ago, I never got to the Franklin Institute to see if either of these guys was a member of the Franklin Institute, an early member. Now you would think, they lived right there where the Franklin Institute was being founded. You would think that they would be on the rolls of some of the original members. So I never got to do that until last week. So for you, I went to the Franklin Institute. I got an appointment with the archivist. I went into the basement, which is where the archives are, and I had never been in those archives. I froze my cell. You know how freezing archives always are, terrible. And I went through the whole early record book, which starts in 1824 and goes up to 1831. Happily, it has not been digitized, so I got to look at the real book. It's so much better to look at the real documents than either to go through the microfilm or to just look on the computer. So I got to go through the book. It was exciting. The writing was legible. It was fascinating. All these many different artisans are named carpenters and paper hangers and everything that you can possibly imagine. And neither Alexander Turnbull nor Thomas Ogle was in the book. Big disappointment. I, of course, had hypothesized and wished that Thomas Ogle, who was interested in science and who wasn't interested so much in conspicuous consumption, would be in the book. But he wasn't in the book, and neither was Turnbull in the book. So the archivist was very apologetic. She felt, oh dear, I didn't find what I was looking for. But as I told her, negative evidence is negative evidence. It's still evidence. So my evidence was that even though this great thing was being founded down the street, these guys didn't belong. So I don't know why. I don't know why. It's curious. It's mysterious. You know, maybe only certain family, but I don't think so. It wasn't a matter of elitist, you know, connections. It was just the way it was. So I didn't miss them. I really looked hard. But Ogle's son, also Thomas Ogle, in partnership with someone named George Watson, had a factory running on water power near the falls of the Schuylkill, which was considered a marvel of ingenuity and efficiency. Turnbull's son attempted to start a newspaper that supported labor's growing complaints related to exploitation. The point here is that the possessions are expressions of more than fashion. They represent choices that people make in support of their views of themselves. And even without documents, we can get at those views archaeologically. And the written record doesn't necessarily back them up. So we're knowing something from the artifacts that is different than the insights we get from just reading their names in the census records or even looking at the Franklin Institute, membership. Another significant structure revealed on the, let's see, did we go here? Yeah, we go here. On the museum, on the Liberty Bell Center site, was this octagonal stone-lined hole in the ground. And that's in the foreground of the slide. It's unique for many reasons. So when we found it, we had no idea what it was. It, incidentally, was at the back of the property that faced Market Street that George Washington lived on. You probably know it as the President's House site. So this is the back corner of the President's House site, which just happened to be part of the footprint of the Liberty Bell Center, so that it was part of our project. So we find this stone-lined hole in the ground that does not appear to be a privy. Privies in Philadelphia are mainly brick-lined. Some of them are barrel and they're wooden, but most of them are brick-lined, and they're smaller in diameter than this great big stone-lined thing. So we, searched, called, tried to figure out. Finally, Todd Benedict, who was doing a lot of the historical research for this project and was also one of my assistants in the field, found a document on the Library of Congress, which was a letter from Robert Morris to George Washington before Washington was president. They were just pals. And of course, it was Robert Morris's house that Washington lived in when he was president in the 1790s. But this letter dates earlier in the 1790s, and it described how to build an ice house. And in that description is virtually a description of a stone-lined hole in the ground that held the ice under the superstructure. So Todd and a graphics person working for John Milner Associates came up with this rendering of what an ice house would have looked like. So, it was unique. Our hole in the ground was octagonal, but it fits what they could reconstruct as what the ice house probably looked like on the back corner of that lot. Todd got very interested in the fact that most of the privies that we've dug in Philadelphia are brick-lined, and this is stone-lined. So he got very interested in who are the artisans who built all these things. It's not easy to line a brick shaft that goes down, 40, 50 feet. So he wrote a big report, which I unfortunately don't have a copy of. And of course, you don't really know. So he was able to find the names of some of those artisans. But again, from historical archaeology, we're identifying people who are otherwise not recognized, and yet are contributing in a very big way to building the infrastructure that everybody depended on and is part of life. So I thought this stone line thing, this ice house, was a pretty great thing. And they had not built the Liberty Bell Center yet. Obviously, we're investigating the site where it was going to be built. So I said they should somehow, what they do in Europe, incorporate the ice house into the building. Why not? You could have a see-through thing in one of the rooms in the Liberty Bell Center, and you would be able to appreciate what had been there earlier. So I argued that with the Park Service, and they said absolutely not. They were building their building the way they wanted to build their building. So I went behind their backs and called the architect and said, architect, why don't you get interested in this and incorporate this feature into your building? And the architect, of course, was chicken and wasn't going to say to his client, I want to do something that you don't want done. And so the Park Service won. We had a big press conference. There I am with Jed Levin, who was the head of history for the Park Service. The press was pretty sympathetic. We got lots of letters of support. It was in the newspaper, blah, blah, blah. And we lost. And the Park Service filled the damn thing up with gravel and buried it. And it's lined with plastic, filled with gravel, and it's under the northwest corner of the Liberty Bell Center. So the next time you're there, you can, when you walk in from the back, you can just imagine that hole in the ground. At least it's not destroyed. At least they didn't bulldoze it. It's still there. It's still there. And, some other generation may interpret it when they finally take that building down. So that was a lost battle. Yes.
Why wouldn't they want to preserve it? Why wouldn't they?
Why wouldn't they?
Would it be a huge expense or?
I don't know. It wasn't in their preliminary plans.
You have to repeat questions.
Oh, I'm sorry. I have just been asked by someone in the audience why the Park Service was so against preserving the ice house when it seems like such an interesting feature. So interesting. We never got a straight answer. It was that they were just dedicated to what they had planned and they didn't want it to be disturbed. Now, if you remember, the African-American community was not pleased with how they were going to interpret the slaves that were in George Washington's house that were lived there when he was president. And so the plans of the Park Service were very seriously disrupted by those demands that were made, much later than our demands for including the ice house. The tragedy of it, the ironic thing about it is, if they had interpreted the ice house, which was where, George Washington, when he had all his, whatever they were called, when he entertained people and answered questions and everything, all the goodies would have been on ice to serve at these, not soirees, but whatever they were called. And you could have told the story of the enslaved people in the household and the servants in the household using the ice house as a feature to tie it to. Instead, they had to do a great big expensive excavation of the whole site, which you may have visited, when there was the platform and you could overlook the walls that they uncovered on the site that belonged to the house. But this was as interesting as any of the features that got uncovered by that later excavation, because it was a really interesting feature, being so different than anything else we'd found in Philadelphia. Anyway, that's that sad story. So the next artisan I want to talk about is Benjamin Humphries. I think I can use this here. So, Benjamin and Mary Humphries came to live on this block where the Museum of the American Revolution is now standing. So you see, this is Chestnut Street, and here's 3rd Street. And I imagine that most of you have been to the Museum of the American Revolution. Anyway, the Humphries were a very nice couple. They came there in 1776, a few days after the Declaration of Independence had been read in Independence Square. And presumably they moved because Benjamin wanted to change his occupation. He was a cutler, and he didn't want to make screws anymore. So this is the ad that he ran in the paper. He said, "To be sold by the subscriber, a complete engine for cutting clothiers, timber, packing, tobacco, and other screws from 1.5 to 6 inches in diameter. Likewise, a machine accurately made for cutting boxes to fit them. And as the subscriber intends to decline that business, he will undertake to instruct the purchaser and make him fully acquainted with every particular relative to the art of screw cutting, so that he may not labor under any difficulty in carrying on the work to the greatest advantage." I love that ad. And I am suspecting that poor Benjamin Humphries was having a midlife crisis. He was 44 at this time, And they, made this significant move. They were Quakers. They had to change their meeting house. We have documents that talk about them rearranging what meeting they would go to. And even though there is a very brief mention of Benjamin wanting to go in the tavern business, he got a license, and before they actually made the move, he didn't go in the tavern business. So let me just go through. So this is the site, and you see those 19th century buildings that are still standing on the north side of Chestnut Street, right across from the museum. Those are the kinds of buildings with the deep basements that I was telling you about, where, the building gets taken down and they put all the rubble in the deep basement, and then we look under the rubble, under the floors, and find stuff. So, one reminds oneself how large the buildings were. And of course, they were standing on this site too, until the Park Service built a visitor center on that site in 1976. When the museum location was changed to this place, they took down the visitor center. They took down most of the visitor center. We had to stand there to be sure they didn't disturb anything that hadn't already been disturbed. Now, in this case, you would certainly think there would be nothing to find, because not only was there a big 19th century building with deep basements, several buildings with deep basements on this site before the Park Service took it down to make their visitor center. Then there was the visitor center. So there had been recurrent construction. So what in the world is going to be left of Benjamin and Mary Humphries' little household on Carter's Alley? So let's see, did I show you the map? So notice that Carter's Alley went right through the block, but it was covered over when they built the visitor center. However, so there is Benjamin and Mary Humphries' lot, or house lot. And there is two privies. One privy was closed in the 1830s, and the earlier privy, the one in the background, was closed in the 1790s, I think the early 1790s, maybe when Benjamin Humphries died. Anyway, so the artifacts in that privy tell us something about the Humphries and how they lived. And these are artifacts from that privy, including all that beautiful creamware, typical 18th century dishes, and those incredible teapots. This is my favorite teapot of all the teapots I've ever dug. And then there's this beautiful teapot. So, and this is a typical Quaker, an upstanding Quaker family, all those nice plain dishes and those lovely hand-painted teawares. And, you had expectation that this was a very upstanding household and had made this move to this new place to live. However, the guy who analyzed the glass that came out of the site, and his name is Alex Bartlett, said it was a tavern. I said, Alex, don't be ridiculous. These were this lovely Quaker couple. They had all these beautiful dishes. He was a cutler. They changed their meeting house. They and manumitted their slave at the same time they made the move. They had a slave named Kwanchiba, and they manumitted her. There's a document that tells us that. He said, Rebecca, this was a tavern site. So taverns in those days were licensed. So we searched all the documents for the license that went with the tavern. And I went to the Historical Society, and Todd, my assistant, who did a lot of historical research, went to the archives, and he found this fabulous document. And in this document, as you can see, it says the Commonwealth must be versus Mary Humphries. And if you go down here, it says, this is a bunch of people's names, who is the jury, impaneled, returned, guilty. That Mary Humphries here is guilty of keeping a disorderly house, whereof something or other, but that she is not guilty of the particular charges in the bill. We don't know what that means. A disorderly house was defined in those days as an unlicensed tavern with prostitutes hanging around. So maybe there weren't prostitutes hanging around, and we can't know that. But anyway, that's the part maybe she wasn't guilty of. But what she was guilty of, this is the judgment against her. Judgment that she is committed to the jail of this city till Saturday week next, is that what it says? And that on the said day, she be carted through the city, that she be afterwards confined in the workhouse at hard labor for 3 months, that she pay the costs of this prosecution and stand committed till this sentence is completed. Wow, that's a pretty strict judgment for somebody who isn't guilty of all the charges. But that's Mary Humphries, and that is what seems to have been going on there, even though, they were this nice Quaker couple who we wouldn't suspect would be guilty of such a thing. We don't know exactly what Benjamin was doing, he who had given up making screws. Was he working in the tavern? Why is it that she gets blamed, even though the scholar who has studied taverns in this period said women often get blamed more often than men, imagine that, for unlicensed taverns. A tavern in this situation would have just been like a table in your front in your front room, where people sat around and talked about politics and smoked and drank out of punch bowls. And you see the punch bowl on the left, and they're just passing that around from one person to another. So it just turns out that we got an incredibly gorgeous punch bowl out of that site. And if you've been to the museum, it's on the second room, lower right. So it says success to the Tryphena. So punch bowls that had that message, success to the whatever the boat was, were often made in honor of, the boat just being launched for the first time. So fortunately, as I'm sure all of you know, the newspapers are online, and we could search in the newspapers and find out about the Tryphena. So we found out that the Tryphena sailed mainly between Liverpool and Philadelphia, and it brought mainly textiles from Liverpool. So if you looked up at the top, just imported in the Tryphena, Captain Smith, and to William, to be sold, Captain Smith from Liverpool, and to be sold at the very lowest terms for cash by William Waterworth at his store on Walnut Street, and the fresh assortment of choice 3 to 4, 7 to 8, and yard-wide household cotton checks, 7 to 8 wide linen, blah, blah, blah. So other kinds of textiles. So neat to know that the Tryphena is carrying all that stuff, and that they have a punch bowl, honoring them. And down here is another one of these things with Tryphena and other people bringing in other things that are going to be sold in Philadelphia. And this one mentions that sometimes the Tryphena went to South Carolina. However, we never hear what Philadelphia sent abroad, except in this one case. And there's this wonderful notice. It's the last paragraph there. A memorial from the merchants and traders of this city to the merchants and manufacturers of Great Britain, praying them to interest themselves in endeavoring to get the Stamp Act repealed and other regulations in our trade redressed, is now drawn up and signed, and is to be forwarded by the Tryphena Captain Smith for Liverpool. Well, we found this on the site of the Museum of the American Revolution, which, needless to say, is telling the story of the American Revolution. So finding an artifact that related so closely to their mission was pretty darn neat. So, and they were the client, they were paying the bill for doing this archaeology. So they were grateful, and they're very appreciative. And the bowl, they even reproduced the bowl for the shop, and they made magnets, and they had a T-shirt. This is when the shop first opened. Those things are not there anymore. Unfortunately, they had a trivet. I have one of the trivets, but it was my first, I've been an archaeologist for a long time. Nobody ever bothered recreating the artifacts that we had dug up out of the ground. So it was very gratifying, and it's very gratifying also that the museum is taking care of the collection. So they're curating the collection. When we do these urban archaeology projects, which you probably know, most of the artifacts get stored, get taken apart again, put in cardboard boxes and sent to Harrisburg for permanent storage. So most of the artifacts never get seen again. But in this case, the museum wanted any of the artifacts that date to the period that they're interested in. So the artifacts are being used in the educational program. They're being used to teach people how to glue artifacts together properly, how to interpret artifacts. It's fabulous. So it makes me feel good that all of that is happening. So we don't know why the Humphries had this punch bowl, or whether they knew about this significance of the message, or we don't know, but we know. And then there was also another punch bowl in the Humphries privy, which is maybe the earliest porcelain ever manufactured in the United States before the Revolutionary War. And it was probably manufactured by Monin and Morris, who had a factory that was only open from 1772 to 1774 and was around the corner from where the museum now stands. And we didn't know what it was made of when we first saw it, because it's not the kinds of ceramics that we're familiar with and can identify. And it turns out that we didn't know that because chemically it had to be tested, and the person who tested it was in Canada. All sorts of experts had to be brought in, and to prove that it was real porcelain, that people had figured out how to get enough heat so that you could make porcelain. And so that's the bowl. And it is in the museum also, but it isn't identified as coming out of the archaeology, which is a disappointment. So that is, go forward. So the next artisan I want to talk about is a little different. Yeah. John Milner Associates, the company I worked for and did all those projects I've talked about, was hired in 2005 to find the Willie Sutton escape tunnel at Eastern State Penitentiary. As you can see, I've had a very interesting projects. I'm so lucky. So this one I loved. Willie Sutton, as you surely know, was a famous bank robber. Oop, this comes on in a minute. Come on. Oh. There it goes. Isn't that great? Somebody else did that for me, needless to say. So that's a book in which Willie Sutton claims to be a great bank robber, of course, and also the jailbreaker of our story of the most daring bank robber and jailbreaker of our time. So the book's written by Quentin Reynolds, but he interviewed Willie Sutton, who was, an incredible liar. I mean, he said he did all sorts of things that he didn't really do. But don't you love that cover? I love it. Anyway, the reason that the Eastern State Penitentiary hired us to find Willie Sutton's escape tunnel was that they told these stories with glee of this famous bank robber who had escaped from their tunnel, from their prison. Now, I don't really know if they believed those stories or not, or they were just taking advantage of a famous guy, Willie Sutton, because there are letters that were written by the prisoners when they escaped. They were asked to, when they were recaptured, they were asked to write a description of their experience. And in those descriptions, Clarence Klinedinst, who was a plasterer and had the cell on the outside wall from which the tunnel extended, is the guy who built the tunnel. It was not Willie Sutton, it was Clarence Klinedinst. So even when I told the personnel at Eastern State that it was Clarence Klinedinst, which they may have known or pretended not to know, because it wasn't nearly as racy a story as thinking that you were dealing with Willie Sutton. Anyway, this was a great project. And our problem was to, I really don't need to know, look at my notes for this. Our problem was to find both the entrance and the exit to the tunnel. And there were photographs that were taken after the tunnel escape. So this shows inside Clarence Klinedinst's cell. And what he did was he plastered, he was, his work job in prison was being a plasterer. And so he managed to get himself a cell on the outside wall. And when he plastered his cell, he covered up a hole. He left it open so that he would be able to go into the wall and start his tunnel. which obviously he had decided he was going to do. And he covered it up with a panel, and that panel is standing behind, leaning against the wall. So that was the panel, and then there was a laundry bag hanging on top of that panel. So at night, when he wanted to go down and dig the tunnel, he took the panel off and went down, created a hole going into the wall, and then down 12 feet, I think, and then across the yard, which was 97 feet wide, and then 15 feet deep. He had to dip down and go under the outside wall of the prison, and you, of course, know that wall. So what our first job was to find, we knew what cell we were going to, but on the outside, where is the outside? Oh, well, here's a diagram that was made after the prison escape and really shows you how he went down below his cell. There's a ladder going down, and then the tunnel goes all the way across the prison yard, as I've just described, and then up outside the wall. So we had to find the tunnel exit, and that was pretty easy because we had found the picture you saw before. Well, any of these pictures, you can see the you just count the blocks, and this is after the break, and so this is the hole that the escapees came up out of, and there are the archaeologists digging at the same place, along the wall, and indeed we found the tunnel exit. That was easy. Going down from inside the cell was a whole different story, because after the prison break, they filled the hole with concrete and sand. So it was a holy mess. And we archaeologists were not strong enough to really get into that. And so we had to have our groundskeeper, John Milner Associates, come, who was much stronger and who could drill into what was hell for him, because he's holding this huge thing and drilling into the wall. And he could only get down as far as the tunnel began. So we couldn't really open up the entry to the tunnel. We couldn't get to that ladder that you saw in the picture, which was too bad, but it was something. So then we needed to figure out if the tunnel was still open crossing the yard. So we used ground penetrating radar. This guy named Bill Chadwick, who did ground penetrating radar, made a grid across the yard. So Klinedinst cell was right, oops, I've lost the ability. Oh, there it is. Ooh, up here. So the cell is right in here. So, we were going to see if you could determine the route of the tunnel across the yard and if it was still there. And so he saw a couple of sort of weak disturbances. What happens is, they send a flash down into the ground, basically, and it's interpreted by a computer. And if it's a disturbed pattern, you know that something is a difference. There's a difference in the soil. And so the indications were not very strong, but there was some indication. And so we used a probe to go down in, and it was empty. And the next day, it was not empty. And we used a sewer camera, which we had to rent, and you could see the shoring that's left there. Just a little bit. So it looked as if the shoring was still in place and that the tunnel was still open, at least at that one place where the radar had indicated, there was a difference in the compaction, basically. Then the next year, so they got so much out of that, the Eastern State got so much out of that, they're still talking about Willie Sutton, even though I'm talking about Clarence Klinedinst. But they hired us the next year to celebrate the 61st anniversary of the tunnel escape. And we rented a much fancier thing to look down into the tunnel, including this little robot crawler. And then, the people who were standing around just loved the robot crawler. And there is the image up there. And you can see the arch of the tunnel right there. So it's pretty cool. So we marked that on the ground. I don't know what they're doing with it now. And I don't know if they're still telling the story and still giving Willie Sutton the credit. I don't think so. I did hear rumor that they now have a place called Kliney's Yard. They're calling Clarence Klinedinst Kliney. But I haven't gone to see exactly how they're dealing with the tunnel escape. Yes?
My mother used to tell the story that she was riding in a taxi cab down Fairmount Avenue, and the police stopped all the cars to look for Willie Sutton, and he wasn't in the taxi. So
I love it. I love it. Yeah. Yeah.
What year was the tunnel built again?
1945. Yeah. And incidentally, the artifacts that we found in the escape hole, we have 1945 nickel, 1940 something milk bottle. I mean, it was completely confirmation that was indeed the hole. So that was it's always nice when the artifacts are consistent. They don't confuse you. So that was that. Let's see. 12 men, I think we have a picture of them, exited the tunnel on April 3rd, 1945. With one exception, none of the men stayed out very long, and some, including Willie Sutton, were apprehended as soon as they emerged from the ground. Klinedinst was caught within hours, and his cellmate, William Russell, made the mistake of visiting his old girlfriend, whose father was a policeman. He resisted arrest and was shot 7 times. 4 other escapees stole a parked milk truck and drove around until they literally ran into a police car. James Grace hid out in a nearby city park, but got so cold and hungry that he went back to the prison gate and asked to be readmitted. So much for the famous escape. So I can't help but be impressed by Klinedinst's ingenuity and perseverance. It took a year to dig a tunnel through the unstable fill that the prison is built on. How it didn't and still hasn't collapsed is a bit of a miracle. I don't know if they are still telling the Willie Sutton story at Eastern State. I hope they have replaced it with a more believable story of Clarence Klinedinst, the artisan who used his abilities to do the impossible. Which brings me to a final point. It is not easy to tell stories about the past, even the recent past. Frank, sitting over here, my friend, and I have been doing research on Hopkinson House, which is where we live in Center City on Washington Square. He has read a book about Ed Bacon. And I have read a book about Albert Greenfield. Thank you. My mind is disappearing. And so Ed Bacon, of course, is the famous designer who recreated Society Hill. And Greenfield, that's not the right name. It is. Is the guy who funded the project. So in the end of the Ed Bacon book, it extols Ed Bacon, as being this genius who, and, he's on front of Time magazine, who has revived the Society Hill neighborhood and made this beautiful thing and did urban planning that nobody else has been able to do. And Greenfield, of course, claims that it could not have been done if he hadn't been able to think up a financial way of having private and public money combined and used. And so those 2 books are by reputable historians, and they have a completely different take on how something in our very recent past, that we're talking the 1960s, 50s, 60s, happened. So that is my task, my challenge has been to write stories about the more distant past, but we are always knowing how hard it is to know what really happened back there. So these are my 2 books about Philadelphia, which deal with this. I have other books about other places and other projects. So the little book, as John said in the introduction, you can buy for $5 if you have, No, $20 if you have $20 in cash or a check. And the other book can be ordered, and I left flyers on the table, so the flyers tell you how to order it, or you could get it from Amazon. Digging in the City of Brotherly Love. Most of the projects that I've talked about today are in Digging in the City of Brotherly Love. And of course, the Humphries are in Archaeology, of the site of the Museum of the American Revolution. That's it. I've loved the opportunity of being able to talk about these artisans from my projects. Thank you.
You said something about Pittsburgh. You grew up in the Schofield district of Pittsburgh. You need to repeat the question. I don't think did any book in Pittsburgh. You know, people are doing that because they have these like beige colored books on different, the Frankfurt district here or the Schofield district in Pittsburgh. But I just finally got around to buying the book, and there's really 20 or 30 things that sort of know about, but none of them are in the book. So maybe you'll see, you can research, and you can do your own updates and book. It's like a historical information, and so you can make your own book. But I don't think you may have already.
I haven't done any work in Pittsburgh, but a lot of work has been done in Pittsburgh, absolutely. And as a matter of fact, the guy who is now the CEO of the Museum of the American Revolution did very important. He was an archaeologist before he was a historian, before he was a museum director, and he has done a lot of work in Pittsburgh.
Google him, you may have written a book already, something like that.
I don't know.
But you said you traveled to Pittsburgh. Is that because you have neighbors or relatives there?
That was when my great-grandma lived there, yeah. And then we went on the sleeping train. I loved sleeping trains. From Syracuse, New York to Pittsburgh. Yes, Susan?
Just a fun fact, back on the back shelf, we have a bunch of glass bottles that were dug up from local critics.
Yeah.
They're all for sale.
Well, I just want to mention that. I noticed those glass bottles because we don't know whose bottles they were, right? Because they were just dug up out of a privy. We don't know who they belong to, who dropped them there, who's.
The privy diggers who, there's a couple of guys who do this in the area. They may have information about it, but I do not know.
Generally.
Where exactly they came from, but I've tried to pull out ones that had logos on them that were from Philadelphia.
Absolutely. Wonderful, wonderful. However, the problem with digging bottles up out of privies is that you go through all the different layers. And even though I haven't emphasized this, is when we excavate any privy, we go layer by layer by layer. And the reason we have to do that is that different people lived in the place that was and threw out their trash at different times. So you get a bottle out of one layer that belonged to, the Humphries family, and then you get another bottle out of a layer that belonged to a different family. And so it's really the people who just dig through all those layers to get goodies are doing a disservice to the people who actually lived there and whose trash it was. And they can't tell stories. They can only say, we got the bottles. And yeah, they're just, which are nice and they're pretty. And I love that, I see them back there. But it always reminds me of this problem. It's a problem.
There's another thing I'd like to mention. We talked about the Jolly Post.
Yes, I love that.
It was just a walk and a half away
Wow.
from here.
Yeah.
In fact, this land that we're on was part of their orchard. And there's a lot of vacant, open land that's behind where their establishment was that probably have their privies and their stables. It's all open, and I thought how easy it would be to excavate underneath this property right now because there's nothing built on it. There was a fire about 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's just open.
Those kinds of sites are great, especially, for the Friends School had a field school in archaeology and could teach people how to do archaeology properly. And here you have a rich, potentially very rich site right down the street. It would be wonderful. It's fantastic, but you don't want a bottle hunter to go dig on that site and dig through all the.
Some interested party to investigate this property.
Right. Well, does this school go up to high school?
9th grade.
Goes up to 9th grade. Well, then I don't know. Is there a history teacher there? I'm sure there's a history.
And
Well, it would be very interesting. It would be very interesting to contact them.
There's, well, there's a number of universities here in the city.
And there's also Temple, which has an active historical archaeology program. And the beauty of doing field school is you're training people, but you're also getting free labor. You know, I mean, obviously, you know, to mount a real excavation is very expensive. But if you do it as a field school and it's being properly taught, you can get that free labor to do both the excavation and the analysis.
What year was the lady sent to jail for the disorderly house?
Isn't that amazing? 1784.
Was that Wall Street prison?
I don't know where she was put. You mean Walnut Street prison? The Walnut Street prison. Yeah, you know, I had never connected that up, but probably, right? Probably that's certainly when that prison was there. But we don't really know if she went to prison. I mean, you know, we don't have any information. She did go back to Carter's Alley and live there until the 1830s, so that second privy has artifacts from when she was living after she had been running the illegal tavern. Yeah.
Thank you very much. This has been an excellent talk. We appreciate your coming out
Well, thank
and
you.
sharing your information with us. It was a very exciting talk, I thought. Please be sure to mark your calendars for the second Tuesday of September. Jack McCarthy is going to talk about the Poquessing Creek project, which is underway, and we'll hear all about it in September. Thanks for coming or joining us remotely.